I'm very honored tonight to be able to introduce our distinguished guest. I'm going to make a very short, brief introduction which only briefly touches on his extensive experience in the area of human rights. Dr. Ahmad Shahid is an internationally recognized expert on foreign policy, international diplomacy, democratization, and human rights, especially in the Muslim states. He has twice held the office of Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of the Maldives. In that position, he promoted human rights standards and norms and led the Maldives human rights, led the government's efforts to sign and ratify all 9 international human rights conventions, to implement them in law and practice, and to improve the country's compliance with its UN treaty body reporting obligations. Dr. Shahid also opened the first permanent mission of the Maldives in Geneva in 2006 to engage with the United Nations Human Rights Council. He established a non-governmental human rights organization to contribute to civil society's work to advance respect for human rights in his country, and later worked as a member of the Presidential Commission to investigate corruption and as a foreign policy, and served as a foreign policy advisor to the president of his country. Dr. Shahid has been extremely active also in the international level. In April 2009, the Center for the Study of Islam and Democracy in Washington presented Dr. Shahid with the Muslim Democrat of the Year award. And in 2010, the President of Albania awarded him the Medal of Gratitude for his contributions to peace and human rights in the Balkans. On June 17, 2011, immediately after the most recent election in Iran, Dr. Shahid, in 2011 was when Dr. Shahid was appointed by the President of the United Nations Human Rights Council to serve as a special rapporteur to Iran on the situation of human rights in Iran. Special rapporteurs are appointed by the Human Rights Council and serve in their personal capacities. They undertake to uphold independence, efficiency, competence, and integrity through probity, impartiality, honesty, and good faith. They are not United Nations staff members, and they do not receive financial remuneration for their services. Dr. Shahid commenced his duties officially as Special Rapporteur on the human rights situation in Iran on August 1st, 2011. In this position, he is responsible for discharging his mandate, and it involves basically 4 different kinds of activities. One is monitoring and investigating human rights violations, transmitting urgent appeals and letters to Iran on alleged violations of human rights, undertaking country visits to Iran and to the region, and engaging with relevant stakeholders, submitting reports to the General Council and to the Human Rights Council on the situation of human rights in the Islamic Republic of Iran, and engaging on issues involving human rights in various forums in the national and international arenas. Dr. Shahid has presented 2 reports to the General Assembly. His first report was in October 2011, and his second in October 2012. He has also presented 2 reports to the Human Rights Council. The first one was in March 2012, and the second one was very recently in March 2013. In his latest report, Dr. Shahid concluded that there continue to be widespread, systematic violations of human rights in the Islamic Republic of Iran. He also noted that reports communicated by NGOs, human rights defenders, and others concerning violations of human rights, their own human rights, and the human rights of others, continue to present a situation in which civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights are undermined and violated in law and practice. The Special Rapporteur states in his latest report that a lack of government investigation and redress generally fosters a culture of impunity, further weakening the impact of the human rights instruments that Iran has ratified. Dr. Shahid's reports are primarily based on primary interviews and secondary sources which document human rights violations under international law. The Islamic Republic of Iran has failed to allow the Special Rapporteur to visit Iran in accordance with his mandate, despite his repeated request to visit the country. The Special Rapporteur and his reports evaluate Iran's record in the context of the recommendations voluntarily adopted by the government of Iran during the first Universal Periodic Review of the country, as well as the 5 major human rights conventions Iran has signed on to. Dr. Shahid is the 4th Special Rapporteur to Iran on the situation of human rights. The first was Andres Aguilar, who served from 1984 to 1986. The second was Rinaldo Galindo-Cole, who served from 1986 to 1995. And the rapporteur just before Dr. Shahid was Maurice Capitorn, who served from 1995 to 2002. Dr. Shahid is also a visiting lecturer at the University of Essex in Colchester, England, and at the City University of New York in the United States. On June the 13th, 2013, just the day after the election, Dr. Shahid said that Iran's presidential election had been neither free nor fair because the government had silenced journalists and opposition leaders in the run-up to the election. Dr. Shahid noted that the mass disqualification of candidates, especially for reasons that were not transparent and that appear to be quite unreasonable, violated the right to political participation. According to the Special Rapporteur, a lack of space for people to conduct free elections exists in such an atmosphere. Prior to the election, Dr. Shahid had warned that the election would lack legitimacy because dozens of Iranian journalists were behind bars and hundreds of political prisoners remained in custody, and because of discrimination against women candidates for election and ongoing restrictions on freedoms of expression, association, peaceful assembly, and religious freedom, all of which constitutes serious violations of rights guaranteed by international law. According to Dr. Shahid, elections are free and fair not only because the vote has not been rigged, but because the general environment under which the election is carried out has to also be friendly in order for people to be able to exercise their expression of liberty. I want to ask you to join me in welcoming Dr. Shahid.
Good evening. I'm really very happy to be here. It's an honor to be here to speak to such a great audience. So I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me and to Nancy Hormushi for very generous description you gave of not all of it is perhaps as you described, but I'm happy that you said those things. Mr. Rouhani has been quoted recently as saying that in Iran the balance between people's rights and the government's interests need to be readjusted. He was speaking about the focus on the state's rights being emphasized too much at the expense of citizens' rights. And he was saying it was time the balance swung towards people's rights. I hope he sticks to his words. I've written to him a letter shortly after he spoke those words, again expressing my interest to visit Iran, and again stressing the need for him to live up to his pledges, and then stressing the need for cooperation, as he said repeatedly in the election, on engagement with UN mechanisms, with the international community. So that's where I hope to begin working with him. But before I get to that, let me provide some context to the work I do. And with your leave, of course, I am tempted to stop speaking and ask questions and offer myself for a dialogue with you, given the attentiveness of the audience here. But I thought, with your leave, I will speak to about 5 points tonight. The first is to give some context, and of course, my work has been made easy by the previous speaker. A context to UN procedures, who we are, how we work, what tools we have, and how we can be effective. And the other is on my methodology in terms of working on Iran, given the non-cooperation that characterizes Iran's approach towards the mandate. And thirdly, I thought, even though all of you are familiar with it, I might just spend a little time speaking about the issues I have been writing in my reports. There are about 7 or 8 issues I have been focusing on in my reports. I thought I might just run them past you. And then, if there's still time, if you're still awake, I might spend a little time just giving my views on whether or not the mandate has any impact on the situation in Iran. And finally, it will be good to think about, spend some thoughts on looking at the future, the way forward. Now, special procedures actually were set up at the UN because countries were unwilling to submit themselves to scrutiny by various bodies. The treaty bodies are experts who can only examine a country when they volunteer to do so. That is to say, they can only be examined when a country agrees and signs that treaty. So when countries don't sign a treaty, then they cannot be brought before a treaty body to examine how they have been performing. And even if they do sign a treaty, sometimes there's such a huge backlog of countries to examine that a country can not appear before a committee at a higher frequency than once in 4 years. In some cases, not even once in 8 years. Iran's case, I think the first review was in the early 1990s. Second review happened this year and year before. So it's about 18 years in between. What special procedures do is allow the UN to bypass these voluntary acceptance by countries and create a facility by which people can act as the eyes and ears of the Council to forewarn them of the situations, to study emerging situations, and then to let countries express their views and concerns about those situations. There are what are called country-specific mandates. Iran mandate is one of those. There are about 10 or 12 such mandates. One for North Korea, one for Myanmar, one for Cambodia, one for Somalia, Haiti, and so on and so forth. Iran is one of these mandates. One of the earliest country mandates, in fact, is the Iran mandate. There are also thematic rapporteurs, experts who study issues of general concern, such as, for example, expert on right to education, expert on torture, expert on right to food, and among them also working groups, such as working group on violence against women, working group on detention arbitrarily, and so on and so forth. What these experts, well, the total number is about 72 now, including working groups, country mandates, and thematic mandates. What they do is they address areas of concern and then forewarn the Council of issues, and then once they bring the matters to the Council, of course they are examined and countries express their views on this. But in all of these situations, country cooperation is still necessary. A country visit cannot take place, whether you're a thematic rapporteur or a country mandate holder, without that country agreeing to that visit. So one of the an important element of our work is getting the cooperation of the country concerned. I, for example, cannot go to Iran unless I was given a visa. There was one case of a rapporteur actually going to a country without a visa and getting deported. That probably isn't the best thing to do. But even if you did manage to come into the country, you still need state cooperation to be able to visit prisons, to meet people without the state actually following them or trying to engineer reprisals against them. There have been examples of that, where countries are actually carried out reprisals against people giving out information. But giving permission doesn't mean compromising the mandate's independence. So for example, I should be able to visit any prison of my choice without giving prior notice, without giving them time to stage, manage, conditions there. If that isn't the case, then there's really no point in going to a prison, because a country can just show, what they would like to see, or even set up certain sections of prison for you to inspect, and then you have to report on those. So while cooperation becomes an important part of the mandate, such cooperation cannot come at the cost of the mandate's integrity and independence. When I came onto this mandate, the Iranian parliamentarians were quoted in the press saying, well, he can come to this country as a tourist, which for me doesn't work, because I don't want to go. I mean, I would love to visit Iran, of course, but my work will require me to go not as a tourist, but as somebody with some authority who can speak to people, who can meet people, who can visit places of detention and inspect what is going on there. I was also advised in the press that I could come to Iran not to visit prisons, but to, of course, understand Iran's advances in science and technology. Yes, I would do that also, but let me also visit a prison or other prisons where I believe people need to be looked into as to their situation. So, special procedures, they on the one hand require the cooperation of the country to which they are accredited. At the same time, such cooperation cannot come at the cost of the mandate's independence. Now, what tools do we have? Just heard I have given 2 reports to the Human Rights Council in Geneva and 2 reports to the General Assembly, and I'm just now drafting my 3rd report after this current tour to the Assembly to be heard in October. So these reports have a word limit, 10,000 words. I know everybody is eager to tell me their experience, and I am very eager to listen and document, and I do that as well. But when I compile the report, it must all fit in within 10,700 words, and that's a wholly, it's a religious limitation. I cannot exceed that. The UN won't translate anything that goes beyond that, and after I'll be told they can't even print because of the costs involved in that. So that's the absolute limit. And for my effort, for having done that, I get 45 minutes of discussion in the Human Rights in the General Assembly in New York, where 198 states might vie to speak, in which case they get 10 seconds each perhaps. But typically, in my experience, about 25 countries speak, so each speak about 2 to 3 minutes. They do make an important contribution. Typically, I will present my report, followed by Iran, in my case, making their defense of the report, and the other countries commenting on the report. Countries try to get friendly countries to take the floor and occupy that time. This happens quite often, but in Iran's case, this has not happened. And that is an indicator of how concerned countries are about what's happening in Iran. I get 60 minutes in March in the Human Rights Council, in addition to me and Iran and member states, NGOs can also speak. In Iran's case, in Geneva, what are called GONGOs, government-owned NGOs, are quite they're in large numbers, and even they can take the floor and run down the clock, as it were. But that has not prevented independent NGOs from speaking out as well. So the debates in these bodies is important, because they also produce at the end, a resolution which can tell a country concerned how popular or unpopular they are in terms of the global opinion. Now, no country likes to be trashed by the international community. Least of all Iran. Iran is a country which really cares and should care about its reputation. So these resolutions are also quite important. In addition to that, I am entitled to issue any number of press statements about issues of concern in Iran. I can also submit any number of confidential communications of 2 types to Iran. One are called allegation letters. That is, if I have information that, for example, as we speak, there are executions in Wakilabad prison, and if I have reason to believe my information is valid, then I'm entitled to write to the government asking information, clarification, expressing my concern, and also highlighting what laws they're breaking by what's going on. but it remains confidential until the end of the year when it can become public. And they have some time to respond to these communications. I can also send what are called urgent appeals, and these are typically used when I believe somebody's life is at stake. If there's an impending execution, if my information is valid, or even I believe has reasonable grounds to believe they're valid, then I can send these urgent appeals. If somebody's health condition is going down very badly because of state neglect or state action, then again I can and do use these tools. I have preferred to use these tools not on my own, but in a co-authored manner, drafting other mandate holders to join me, because as a team we make a bigger impact in Tehran, I believe so. So we can issue single-authored press statements and communications, or jointly authored ones. I'll come back to later as to how effective I believe these have been. What are the obstacles that special procedures face? The biggest obstacle, of course, is state cooperation or state harassment in some cases. There have been cases where state harasses certain rapporteurs. In my case too, I suppose some would say there have been less than welcome statements made about me. In debates in the council, the president had tried to intervene twice because the delegation of Iran wasn't making the type of statement they ought to be making. So lack of cooperation affects the work. The other big difficulty is lack of resources. Of course, human rights are the third pillar of the UN, but when I say the third pillar, it means 1, 2, and after 1 and 2 comes 3. So that is the way it is. But I think if you look at the funding, it doesn't even make third pillar grade. It's way behind that. But even if you look at all the funding available and distribute across all the requirements they have, the rapporteurs really get a very small amount of funding. The funding I have allows me to travel twice a year on a 14-day fact-finding mission to Iran or elsewhere where I can meet Iranian communities. That doesn't really cost much. And of course, I'm supported by interpreters, professional UN interpreters, and a very competent UN staff to travel with me. And I'm supported in Geneva by, again, a very competent UN staff. But I have one staff. So it's one staff and me that has to address what's going on in Iran. And that happens to other mandate holders as well. And a third problem we often encounter is lack of follow-up. In my case, of course, I haven't yet been able to go to Iran, but where there have been country visits made, I have noticed that even the UN mechanisms on the ground don't automatically or necessarily follow up on those recommendations because it hasn't been fully integrated. So what happens after somebody goes into, say, Iran, identifies problems and says these have to be done? Of course, government has to do some of these things, but there are other things others can do to promote, to ask the government to do these, which are the UN team on the ground. But I have no guarantee that they will do it because there's no requirement that they should be doing it. So lack of follow-up mechanisms is also an impediment in the work we do. Now, my methodology has been questioned by Iranian delegation. Last time I spoke at the UN debates, I was attacked for, I think you're all familiar with what the allegations were. And of course, the president of the council stopped him, the delegate, and I think he was a bit baffled by that, and he apologized, and he said he had to take the turn because my methodology was inappropriate. And good, it's good to know what the issue is, but the issue is also the address, because his complaint is that my information comes from enemies of Iran. Now, enemy usually has a narrow meaning, but in government of Iran's case, enemy can be very widely used. And that's the problem with countries where there is no freedom of expression, that people who dissent from the state, from the government's line, are treated in that fashion. My other comeback is, even if somebody is enemy, enemies also have rights. Human rights means rights that belong to the person for being a human being. Even terrorists have certain rights. That is, right to due process and right not to be tortured and so on. So I'm not saying I'm speaking of terrorists, but I speak to a wide variety of Iranians from all walks of life. I don't see them as enemies of anybody. They're human beings who have very bad experiences, often first-hand witnesses, victims of alleged violations, or witnesses of these violations. And they all have proper right to speak to me, and for me a duty to listen to them and document their cases. In the absence of cooperation, what I have done is I have looked at information published by the government of Iran. Fortunately for me, Iran does produce tons of information. My main concerns are about, say, executions. Iran is not so coy about writing their figures now. There are many public executions. There are also many listed by government sites, but there are many which are not actually listed. So there are ways to address it. But even if you look at the government's own published documentation, a lot of information is there. Iran also, the parliamentary debates are also published online, bills are published online, so I can access these. For example, if I'm writing about the new penal code, I don't have to go to Iran. I can download it from their website, from the parliament website. It's official website, official documentation. It has to be an official document, and I can speak on that. In addition to that, I have reviewed Iran's own reports to various human rights bodies, the treaty bodies, the Universal Periodic Review, information written on government letterhead and published and presented by government authorities. That's officially valid information. I also rely on official press, official media, as well as non-official independent media, both in country, online, outside the country, and elsewhere. There are also a number of international organizations which have had long-term focus on Iran, or groups that focus on Iran. Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch do credible research on Iran. They have experienced research on Iran, and their information is also quite credible. As well as Iranian organizations outside, like many of you here, who have close connections to family and friends and associates in the country, live connections to them, so we have ready information coming through. Others who have been, collecting and networking amongst themselves for information provision purposes. So I don't have a lot of information that is readily there. The next issue is, okay, what laws should I apply? Now, I have something called a code of conduct, which I must abide by. This was something added on recently by those countries typically who dislike mandate holders. So, the Cubans, for example, are very keen on mandate holders. Cuban others were very good at drawing up a code of conduct, which requires mandate holders to follow certain rules. And one of these rules, of course, is that information accuracy, being cooperative towards government, being friendly towards the government, and so on and so forth. And also applying established yardsticks for monitoring countries. So what I have done is in Iran's case, and of course in this case it works against the government's wishes. The government of Iran's comeback to my report is, Shahid, don't you know we're an Islamic country? So what I was talking about when you said this and that. They speak to me often saying, you're a Muslim, don't you understand these things in the Quran? And they tell me, well, Iran is Islamic country, so we will follow Islamic laws and so forth. Now, whether or not those in Iran conform to Islamic criteria is a different subject. I leave the debate outside. But my comeback is, the code of conduct says mandate holders must apply internationally recognized human rights standards. So the Cairo Declaration of Human Rights is not recognized internationally. That's what the Iranian government is arguing on. So the idea of applying international customary law, international standards as specified in Iran's case, in those treaties Iran has signed as a state. In 1975, Iran signed on to the ICCPR, the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. The same year, same day, signed on to the Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights without any reservation. So Iran didn't say, for Indian articles, there would be limitation in Iran. So it did endorse all the articles in total. Iran is also party to the Convention on the Rights of the Child. In 1990, it became party to that, but there is not a reservation. It said Iran will comply with this convention only to the extent those convention doesn't violate Islamic standards. Now that's not a valid reservation because it doesn't tell anybody what extent anything will be accepted in Iran. So what I've done is I've taken Iran's human rights obligation under these treaties and measured them against what they're doing. And one more One more yardstick I use is Iran's own commitments at the Universal Periodic Review. There was a review done 2-3 years ago in which 53 states took the floor and spoke. They made over 170 recommendations, out of which Iran agreed to implement 123 recommendations. So I asked them, well, you said you will do this. 3 years on the line, how far have you gone down on that? And the answer is, of course, it's still pending. Now, of these 123 recommendations Iran agreed to do, 35% relate to concerns about civil and political rights, free speech, freedom of association, of assembly, and so on. 29% relate to social, economic, cultural rights, for example, rights of minorities, and so on. 22% relate to rights about the rights covered by the Convention on Elimination of Discrimination on Racial Grounds, and 5% on children's rights. So I use this as areas of focus in my study. In addition to that, of course, like I said earlier, I am not bound to limit myself to what Iran has signed. I can even use other aspects. But I think, in my view, these 5 treaties cover the entire gamut of human rights. But I also speak about torture and so on, even if Iran is not party to the CAT Convention. I speak about the women's rights, even though Iran is not party to the Women's Convention. Because under Article 2 of ICPR and of the Civil Economic Rights Covenant, and Article 6 of the ICPR, these are covered in any case. So, in my view, Iran has full coverage under customary international law on the rights that it is actually violating. In addition to that, I have also reviewed what the UN treaty bodies demanded from Iran or said to Iran at the end of their reviews. One was 2 years ago in October 2011. The ICCPR, the Committee for Human Rights, they reviewed Iran's performance on civil and political rights and issued a 25-paragraph conclusion in which they said, as a priority, do one of 4 things, such as make judiciary more independent, stop stoning, and stop executing juveniles, and so on and so forth, and then 20 other recommendations. I also look at those recommendations made just 2 months back, when the Committee on Economic and Social Rights also reviewed Iran and asked Iran to do certain things. And these are called concluding observations, and I asked Iran, look, these are recommendations you're supposed to be complying with, so what have you done with these? These committees won't come back to Iran at least until 4 years have passed, if not more. So in the meantime, people can forget what these recommendations are. What I can do is, twice a year, remind Iran, well, what have you done with these things? It's very important that we keep on doing that. Now, Iran complains that Iran doesn't deserve a mandate holder, that Iran has been unfairly targeted, that the mandate is selective, politicized, and therefore not legitimate. And of course, this is a question widely discussed among member states in the Council. Some have sympathy with that view, pointing out Bahrain, Saudi Arabia as cases where there are violations without a country mandate holder. But my comeback is, yes, the fact that some other country is violating rights is no license for someone else to do the same thing. While Saudi Arabia may not have a mandate holder, Saudi Arabia has received, I'm not defending Saudi Arabia, I wouldn't do that. Saudi Arabia has received mandate holders, thematic mandate holders continuously. Iran has not done that. When Iran said it will receive all mandate holders, the UN stopped the mandate that was there from 1984 onwards and said, okay, no more country mandates. We'll ask thematic people to go into Iran. I think 3 people went in. None of them actually came out with good reports. The last one went in 2005, the report on violence against women, I think it was. And her report kind of froze or further visits to the country. So since 2005, there hasn't been a country visit taking place. So Saudi Arabia is different on that ground. Iran also points out to Israel, and I remind them there is a rapporteur for Israel. The name is different. The name is rapporteur for the occupied territories. So a person goes into the territories and looks at the Palestinians and their plight and reports on the Israeli treatment of the people. So in nearly all the cases where the council is concerned about, there are reporters. So Iran is not being singled out for this. One further reason why Iran should have a country mandate holder is the fact that Iran does not communicate or cooperate with UN mechanisms. Iran has been the country receiving the highest number of communications, not from the country mandate holder, but from other mandate holders, from thematic mandate holders, those on torture, those on arbitrary detention, those on judicial, extrajudicial execution, and so on. The number for a period of 5 years was almost 600, and of which more than half, 54%, were unanswered. And that trend continues, possibly more now. I have issued about 30 communications in 1 year. I don't think I received more than 8 replies. So what fraction is that you can work out? That's more than 54% response rate. So that habit continues. And of those 54 that were responded to, 25 said, no, that is not true. That's it. It didn't really. I mean, allegation is made after a lot of evidence is actually produced. So these are very sound allegations. But they said no. They rejected the communication, saying they don't accept the communication. And then, of course, Iran has one of the highest number of pending requests for visits to the country by thematic reporters. So on these grounds, Iran does stand out from the rest in terms of being a country with human rights concern. And of course, we had in 2009 elections, and the events followed thereafter. It was on the TVs of every country, in every home, everywhere in the world, and people could see that something was going wrong in Iran. People were dying. You also Nada, Sultani getting shot, and a lot more followed. And of course, there was a case to be answered. To this date, no answer has been given. So I don't believe that Iran is being unfairly targeted by a UN mandate holder. Now, if I'm still with you, there are about 8 issues I have been reporting on in my reports, and to leave time for interaction, I will just go through them very, very summarily. My basic contention is that between Iran's constitutional framework and Iran's treaty obligations, the legal framework for Iran to realize their rights actually exists. So the problems occur, there are tensions between Iran's commitments on international law and its violations in practice. So for example, if Iran adhered to its constitution, a large part of the issues, not every issue, a large number of issues would disappear. Because, for example, for the press law guarantees a trial before a jury in open court, but today they get tried in the revolutionary courts without a jury on national security crimes with minimal or no due process safeguards. So, respecting rule of law in any country produces dividends. If Iran respected rule of law, a lot of issues we face today will not appear. Torture is not sanctioned in Iranian law. It's a violation of Iran's own laws. So if my point is, if Iran actually observed rule of law, then this will not be the case. So that is one measure I use. The other, of course, is the violations of Iran's international obligations in its own constitution. So when Mr. Rouhani says the balance has to swing towards the people, I understand that, I welcome that. Because right now, what Iran does is, Iran says, people have the right to associate freely. Fine, that's international norm. Subject to that association being in conformity with Islamic criteria. That's where it goes wrong. I'm not saying anything anti-Islamic here. What I'm saying is, by saying that, you no longer know what that criteria is, because that is set by the Guardian Council. Article 4 of the Constitution says, no law in Iran, every law in Iran must conform to Islamic criteria. And that criteria is understood and known, determined and pronounced upon by the Guardian Council. And therefore, people have no idea whether Islamic criteria will give you, the right to assemble freely, and so on and so forth. And another example is Iran's constitution provides certain religions, guaranteed status. It says for Zoroastrians, Christians, and Jews, they give respective status, guaranteed status as recognized minorities. The following article says, quotes a verse from the Quran, saying this because this is because they are at peace with Iran, and therefore, so long as they observe these limits, they have these rights. So suddenly you make their rights conditional upon them observing certain limits written into the constitution, and these limits do not necessarily conform to the international norms, because in Iran's case, simply practicing another faith can be seen as inimical to the Islamic faith. The problem with the charge against many evangelical Christians is that when they say promote the Christian faith, when they proselytize, they say that's opposing Islam. Could even get charged with blasphemy or Sabban Nabi as well. So these limitations really make the right very vague. So the first point I have been reporting on Iran's report is lack of what I call capricious regard for the rule of law. The laws are there, but they are not observed, and often the laws themselves impose unfair limits on international norms. The press law, for example, gives the journalist certain status, but it identifies 17 examples of impermissible content, and these include reporting or articles that can damage the foundation of the republic. Again, very hard to define what that means. Today it's been defined very liberally, very broadly, so as to limit speech in its broader sense. The press should not insult Islam and its sanctities. Again, that can be a difficult one to go and practice. It should not insult the leader of the revolution and recognize their sanctities, and cannot create discord among modes of life, and so on and so forth. So these limitations, some of it conform to international non-limitations, but it's much wider than is known internationally. The cybercrimes law, again, Iran says every country has cybercrimes law, it is true, but in Iran's case, it's been used to monitor dissident activities and to harass certain people. Bloggers who sometimes get killed in custody, I think, follow these laws. The law on associations prohibit people with convictions of acting against the country, and it's quite widespread now. If you speak to the UN, you could be charged acting against the country. If you are convicted of that, you cannot form an association, nor can you become a member of an association. That's an impermissible limitation on that right. A bill for Parliament on supervising NGOs will create a super committee which can supervise who has the right to be an NGO, and that committee can in fact determine who can actually apply and go to communicate with foreign organizations. So once it becomes law, which NGOs can go to Geneva from Iran will be determined by this body. So you can be sure that only, well, I shouldn't say it, but the fear is that only government-aligned NGOs would get that permission. And of course, we speak about 40 journalists being in prison today in Iran. That's the second highest number for any country in the world. Turkey has more than 40. But 40 is a misleading figure, because just this year, we found in one weekend, I think 23 people were arrested. Reporters were arrested. Some were, of course, released, but all those who are released have carrying a tag, the warning. If you stray one more time, or if you do this or that, you're back in the can again. So 40 in jail is a number we can count on. Others with that tag should also be counted as people on very short notice. So I think suppression of free speech is a very serious problem because and I speak immensely about that in my reports. Torture is endemic in Iran. I describe torture as systemic and systematic and widespread in Iran. And I used that phrase after a very careful thought as to what it actually meant. Because in my judgment, it happened in nearly all prisons. It happened across all provinces. It's systematic because it happened because of the nature of the way things were being conducted. And I also used in my last report a study, again commissioned to the extent for the needs of this of the report, by a British NGO, Freedom from Torture, which documented the testimonies of 50 post-election refugees from Iran. And their testimony is quite damning. Nearly all reported some form of physical torture. All reported being beaten and being bashed at interrogation. A very high percentage, 50%, reported sexual violence. 25% reported being raped in custody. And quite detailed allegations were made. And this pattern compares with the evidence I get from my primary interviews across people in Iran. I've interviewed 400 people. These actually interviews lasting at least 1 hour, sometimes 2 to 3 hours, depending on how much the person wants to talk to me and how detailed the testimonies become. And of these 400, about 30% are people in country. So I've been able to access people in country a lot more than I could perhaps if I went to Iran, without impairing or exposing them to any sort of reprisal by the authorities. So that's the information I have is quite widespread torture. The information I have is people live in fear of the authorities and the Ministry of Intelligence. The biggest concern I have expressed in my report is about right to life and its violation in Iran. Even government data for last year alone was stating that there were nearly 400 executions documented. That makes Iran the highest per capita in the world. Only China has more in absolute numbers, but China has a bigger population as well. But comparing is not the issue here. The issue is the fact that a large number of people are being put to death, and other concerns are the fact that often they are put to death for crimes, for offences which are not seen as capital crime under international law. International law says that, okay, capital punishment is not outlawed, but it's restricted to the most serious crimes. And those crimes typically mean crimes involving a killing, a death. In Iran's case, 80% of those executed are for drug offences. And although there's a drug war of sorts going on there, not everybody is charged for homicide resulting from drug trafficking. So if you are a drug trafficker, you are exposed to capital punishment in Iran. In addition to that, well, you know more than I do, there are a number of crimes or offences in the penal code which people get exposed to death penalty, which wouldn't in other countries. Adultery, for example, you have death penalty in Iran. And consuming alcohol, the third conviction carries a death penalty. Armed robbery, drug trafficking, bribery, insulting Islamic prophets and sanctities, blasphemy, and homosexual acts between consenting adults also carries death penalty. And these have been widened in the new penal code. The new penal code came into effect on 1st of June. This widens the list of capital offences in Iran compared to the previous ones. Iran has been stating to the UN that the new penal code bans child executions, juvenile executions. This is not, in fact, actually the case. It is still possible for juveniles to be executed in Iran, providing the court can make assessment that the person, the child, at the time of the action, was able to know what he was doing. Was not insane. Was aware of the action that was being carried out. So, still, young people, juveniles in Iran, still face death penalty. And of course, the age of majority in Iran is 15 for boys and 9 for girls, and that is a problem. But the fact that a 9-year-old girl can be held culpable for a crime is quite shocking. And I've also raised concerns about the execution method. Stoning, it is still legal in Iran, still possible in Iran, although Iran again has been saying the new penal code actually bans that. One version of the new penal code, which was around last year, did not actually mention stoning. But I said that if you look at the Constitution, Article 167 says a judge must use positive law, then if not, use Sharia law. And if there's a conflict of laws, Sharia law will prevail. So in any case, Sharia law prevails in Iran. And where there is a gap in the law, the judge cannot say there's a gap in the law and stop at it. He should then resort to a fatwa or Sharia decree on that, which means we're back to stoning. So in Iran, stoning remains very much still a possibility. And I've been shocked by claims from Iran that stoning is not either an inhumane way of executing people, or in fact should be considered as act of death penalty. Iran says it's not death penalty. It says they are free. People who have been stoned are free to come out and disappear and go. Now, of course, a man is buried, as you know, up to the waist, and possibly, or just possibly, under a hail of stones might disappear. I don't know. A woman is buried up to her neck or shoulders, and there's no way, a woman can get away from that. But even if you get away from that, idea of being stoned is repugnant, and you cannot call it a humane action. I've also been very concerned about ethnic minorities and their plight. It appears to be the worst violations occur, not so much to the Persian-speaking population, but it gets worse as you go down to the provinces and as you go down in those of deprivation generally, and this happens in the provinces. For example, I have reported on Iran's Arab, Kurdish, Baluch, and Azeri communities, and they are concerned with human rights violations, apart from their cultural rights not being granted to them as they would like them, or as promised in the Constitution. The fact that they feel the brunt of the violations is quite startling. I'll give an example. Even information is difficult to get from these places. Now, Sattar Beheshti, when he was killed in custody, everybody knew about it instantly. Of course, it was too late to do anything about it, but the fact it was known gave a shock to the system, and they had to go through the motions of an investigation. But the same week, Jamil, Ahwazi blogger, died. Of course, I would require corroboration before I can speak out, and so would others. The corroboration cannot be made, when there are communication difficulties and so on. So it took me, I think, 2 weeks to communicate with the family and verify that fact. By that time, of course, reporters people there, they have gone to Syria and elsewhere and go on. They have gone from Beheshti case. So, even in terms of being able to keep a spotlight, it's difficult when it comes to provinces. But my concerns have been about, say, for example, the Kurdish school bus, the porters, who smuggle across the border. They do this for a living. And Iranian border guards, they actually shoot them on sight, typically in questionable circumstances, in my view, with utter contempt for the right to life. And again, this affects the poorer communities. And in my view, even the drug trafficking trade unfairly impacts upon the poor, because the couriers often are poor people, and they get to face the death penalty. I have also spoken about the religious minorities, even the protected ones, the Jews, Christians, Zoroastrians, and the Sunni Muslims. They complain about their rights being violated, both in terms of the practice of their faith and also in terms of allegations regarding other activities. Typically, even for religious minorities, the charge is effectively the same as to other dissidents. They all tried under national security laws. The Yaran, for example, the Baha'i leaders, their charges were also not in terms of religious laws, but in terms of national security laws. And for talking to the diplomats, for writing to the UN Secretary General, for writing to their own presidents, the charge was actually against the state and propaganda against the state. So again, they face a lot of difficulties. I've been concerned about evangelical Christians in Iran facing a lot of persecution more recently, and in fact concerned about statements from senior functionaries stating that evangelicalism is not the version of Christianity that is given protection in the Constitution. That's a new interpretation. And this results in people being detained, churches being closed. Of course, my information is that Persian language surveys are now no longer available in Iran. Persian language Bibles are no longer possible to access in Iran without some sort of penalty attached to being discovered with it. So a lot of prosecution on that as well. Same with the dervishes as well. They also report arrest, detention, persecution, their meetings being disrupted, people being arrested, and even beaten up. It gets worse when it comes to the unrecognized minorities. The Baha'is case is well documented. I have written extensively about the Baha'i situation in my reports because they become non-persons in Iran, and that's quite frightening. You well know, Baha'i cannot inherit from a father if there was a Muslim descendant somewhere in the line, in the family lineage. They can't get to universities if the authorities discover somebody is Baha'i or is part of religions. The Yarasan have the same complaint, although I cannot document with such accuracy, their plight because information is lacking. But the view is a new conservative Islamization trend in Iran, which affects other religious groups in quite a severe manner. Women's rights, again, an area of major concern. I have written extensively because, on one hand, women have gained in terms of education over the past 30 years. Iran is quite happy to flaunt that. But when you come down to the labor market situation, women are not able to work, at least not in the more influential positions. And the constitution bars women from the senior most positions. Women cannot run for the presidency. They can't be a supreme leader, for example, they can be in parliament, but the figure is quite minimal. Women can't be presiding judges. So there are a number of difficulties put in place. And not the least of which, of course, is the law which says a husband can go to court and ask a woman to stay home because a woman working affects the family situation. So women can be barred from working as well. So I have reported on these. As well, the fact that the sexual laws, the morality policing laws, unfairly victimize women compared to men. I have also spoken about LGBT rights in Iran, sexual minorities' rights in Iran, and I've approached this from the perspective of right to life. There were, I think, 3 young people put to death in Iran last year or year before. And I wrote about this, and I've interviewed this community and report on that. Iran, of course, comes back and say they're the first country in the Islamic world to have state-funded gender reassignment surgery. And if we examine it more deeply, it's not a good picture because people are compelled to undertake that surgery. It's not done as you would do in a country where people can choose their gender, because people have to go through the physical mutilation first before they get through the hormonal therapy and the psychological treatment and so on and so forth. So it becomes very traumatized physical mutilation, a maiming of bodies rather than a gender reassignment. So it's not as the way Iran presents it. And of course, there are detailed penal code provisions on the punishments Iran will mete out to those engaging in same-sex activities. Again, distinctions based on gender and religion appear in these provisions. Now, I was planning to go a bit longer, but I'll just summarize here, I'll end here by speaking about my main concerns. I'll just have one more main concern, that is impunity. That is the thing I am really hoping to focus on. The Kairizak prison, in all the details. I only want to say that the fact that somebody like Ghazali was involved in these activities. I've heard many reports of his involvement in numerous things. The fact that the Kairizak prison involved at least three deaths and a lot of torture ends up with him getting $60 fine and a 5-year ban on government offices is not justice. That's what we call impunity. And same thing happens with the Sattar Beheshti case as well. The medical examiner has given, I think, 4 different reports, and people are not sure that it was torture or something else. I mean, he's still hedging on that. Family is, of course, livid about this. The mother is demanding the body being exhumed and a forensics, test being done on determining the cause of death. So again, family doesn't feel, it's been listened to. the international rules on this require that in case of custodial death, and that covers someone's death even after a period of release from prison, the family must be engaged in this process and they must be satisfied on what's being done. So obviously, on none of these cases, we show that Iran will actually comply with these standards. Now, let me very briefly speak about what impact I believe the mandate is having on Iran. If you judge from government's reaction, you know that they don't like the mandate to be there. It's quite strident in its reaction to what it says. I've been called many nice names by the government, and I believe that is a response to what's been in the report. The last statement was that only problem is that the people I write about are ghosts. And implication, if they weren't ghosts, they will release them. So I do hope Mr. Musavi isn't a ghost, Mr. Kerubi isn't a ghost, and if Iran discovers they're not ghosts, they will release them quickly. And the complaint is that there are about 5 people I don't give names in my report. I list several hundred in my reports. On 5 people I have not given the names because I fear that either they or their families might be attacked by the government. The rest are all listed. All I don't have is their address. I have the names, date of arrest and time of arrest. They all listed in my website and in my reports. But Iran is still saying, they have asked me to give these names, I have refused to give those names, and therefore they can't deal with the issue. But that's not fooling anybody. If you look at the UN boards, before this mandate was set up 3 years ago, the UN board in General Assembly was some 62 countries believing Iran had a case to answer. Canada comes up with a resolution each year, and that year 60 states said, okay, Iran must respond to these allegations. The rest either abstained or went for coffee or didn't want to do anything with this. But last year the number was 89, and that's a very high figure for UN for these resolutions. That's the kind of figure that Myanmar was getting just a short while ago. So Iran has gone from being, if you like, low on censure to mid to high level censure by the General Assembly, and Iran will know this. In the Human Rights Council too, the number has gone up. It's a 47-member council. When the mandate was set up 3 years ago, the votes were 22 in favor and 22 countries created the mandate and 7 opposed the mandate. So 7 countries took Iran's view, saying there should not be a mandate. Last year it was only 2 countries siding with Iran, saying okay, no need for a mandate. The 26 said there should be a mandate. So to go from 22 to 26 is a huge jump in the context of the council. So again, the view is that countries are beginning to learn more about Iran and begin to believe less what Tehran says and more what victims of Iran's violations are saying through UN reports and other media. I also believe that where I have issued urgent appeals, there have been numerous cases where government has stopped executions. The count can be about 14. It's not very high, but nevertheless is an important count. I think where intervention is made at the right time, sometimes they do take a pause. And when there has been an outcry internationally, they have pulled back. Past case of Nadakani's case was his case in point last year at the debate in council. Everybody who took the floor spoke about this issue. And the delegate got so actual, he said, well, we don't do this in our country. We have no blasphemy laws, and so on and so forth. And then after a few months, he was released. So these are, if you like, just a trickle. But I think even one is important, and the trick lies in sort of keeping a spotlight on the situation, speaking about it, making other countries know about it, and then making Iran care about it. Now, there is an academic model in literature on how these things happen. Countries first say, no, nothing has happened in this country, go fine. You're familiar with that tone, I'm sure. And then when this happens, there's nothing coming out of the country, but international organizations like Amnesty International, they keep on pounding at the door saying, no, this country is doing this and that. And when this external pressure comes up, the countries say, okay, well, maybe we should change a few things. And they make what are called tactical concessions. They want to buy wiggle room by saying, okay, we'll do a few things, and then hope everybody will move back. But typically when they do this, quite often, what happens is they start a process by which they cannot control the end point of that. In many cases, it goes a lot further. In some cases, maybe not so far, but still enough to keep people self-sustained in terms of what they can do. So I think Iran is now at that point where Mr. Rouhani is saying, well, we need to swing the pendulum back in this side. Now, I think those who advocate for reform in Iran must seize that and make him push the pendulum to a point where he can push it back automatically. If he wakes up one morning and say, okay, let's put the swing balance back on that side, making sure that enough is done to make people actually hold that ground. So I believe it's important in moving forward to make sure there is information coming out of Iran, so people everywhere know what's going on in Iran. So freedom of expression is very important. But there is a homegrown, if you like, NGOs or societies active in Iran in protecting people's rights. They were there a few years ago, but for the past few years they have almost dried out. But I think the space, if can be set up to have these people again become active domestically, we have the homegrown situation in which people will speak out on violations of issues, violations and have people know about that. So once that is done, momentum is built up, then it can create its own space for itself. For my part, of course, I will continue to have dialogue with Iran. I can see the evolving nature of Iran's response. First believing that I would try to report with them jointly, as it were, and then finding out I wouldn't do it, then saying he's illegitimate, he's an American spy, he's a CIA agent, and along the way I have broken a few records because I must be the first person accused of being both a CIA spy and being bribed by State Department. I don't know how but it's evolved. But then after making the accusation, they've also said that Iran needs to change some laws. But Larijani said last March that Iran needs to amend some of its laws. And then we have Rouhani saying a lot of nice things. My point to him is that, okay, Iran has to do this, but his charter is a good idea. But Iran, the charter already exists. Iran's constitution, Iran's treaties, that is there. So you don't talk about new rights, you talk about Iran complying with those obligations. So I hope the charter will comply with those, rather than saying we have these rights subject to X, Y, and Z, which A, B, C will determine. That's the wrong formula. So my call is for the UN and other bodies linked to the UN to keep a close scrutiny, to follow up on those recommendations made by various UN bodies. For example, Iran has been arguing that when faced with issues of LGBT rights, Iran said, no. They first said, you can't talk about that because that's based on international right on those grounds. The committee said, you're wrong, the right exists. It comes under Article 2 of the Convention of Science. So my hope is that, my call is that these bodies keep these lines and others follow up in upholding those lines, saying, where is the accountability for these? What have you done on these things? Because we are moving towards a next review of Iran in September next year, or next year autumn, for the next review of Iran by the entire UN Council. When Iran will stand up and say, look, 4 years ago we said this, we have done this. So we have about 15 months in which to demand from Iran progress reports on what they have done, to implement those facts, and if they have not done those recommendations, to demand explanation and accountability for failure to do so. So I call upon the UN and others to keep more scrutiny. I call upon Iranians to keep the information flow coming, to be active, to be vigilant, and to demand that your rights be honored by the government. I have dropped one subject from the list I mentioned to you, but they are under review. There are 3 things I'm studying. One is sanctions and its impact on people. I'm studying it. I have sent Iran questionnaires for them to respond to, because I can't report on that without Iran giving me data. They've been saying so far there has been no impact of sanctions. That doesn't help me in reporting on that. I'm also looking at the plight of refugees in Iran, not those coming out, but those in country. And I'm also studying the plight of the environment. I've got several reports of the degradation of the environment, not just in the Lake Caribbean region, but generally in Tehran as well, in terms of pollution and so on. So these 3 issues I'm studying for future reports, and that's what I will report on in the next 12-month period. Now, having said all that, if you haven't still bored you to death, I'll be very happy to respond to any questions. My method would be to seek engagement with Iran to seek to cooperate with them, but without compromising my mandate. I have told the Iranians, the more they talk to me, the less I will talk to the press, because I have information coming from them. Because I have to be active. For me, the primary responsibility is the rights of victims. And if the government of Iran won't have dialogue with me about those rights, then I'll have the media talking about those rights. If Iran wants me off the media, then talk to me in the country. That's the approach I'm following. So thank you very much for your